Alright folks, this is going to be our first video for the weekend of November 5th and November 6th. We're actually going to start a new unit, so all these notes I'm giving to you right now will not be on the test on Monday. They will only come, we're basically starting the unit before we take the Unit 5 test. So that way you'll have a little bit of Civil War foundation going into the field trip on Wednesday, and then we'll resume this when we get back to class on Thursday, taking notes and so forth. So this is the start of Unit 6. These notes will not be on the test this coming Monday. All right, so looking at the Civil War and then eventually the Reconstruction that comes afterwards. So the Civil War is going to last from 1861 to 1865, so it lasts 4 years. And it was the most costly of all American wars in terms of loss of life. We lost the most Americans in this war more than any war before or since. We lost more people in this war than all the wars before this one combined. The deaths range anywhere from 620,000 people dying. More modern estimates raise it even higher to 700,000. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 700,000 Americans died in the Civil War because everyone who died was an American. As a result, though, even though we have such great death, you have 4 million people freed from slavery. So even though you have such great death, you have 4 million people freed from slavery as a result of the war. The Civil War will transform the United States society by accelerating industrialization. So this is the Civil War is a huge turning point in American history, if you couldn't figure that out. That it's going to accelerate industrialization up north and make that greatly way more powerful in the second half of the century, and modernization up north as well. And it's going to destroy the plantation system in the South as well as slavery. So the northern economy booms after the war as a result, and the southern economy is destroyed and damaged by the war, and slavery comes to an end. This event is so profound, some historians refer to this as the Second American Revolution, because it makes the country go through such a drastic change in many, many different ways. So today we're going to look at how the war begins and how it starts off and so forth. So Abraham Lincoln takes office in March of '61. Remember that at this point, only the Deep South, these guys right here, have seceded. So only these states have seceded by March of '61 when Lincoln does his first inaugural address. Other states, these states, are watching to see what Lincoln's going to do. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln assures Southerners that he has no intention of interfering with slavery or any Southern institution, which is probably true. And so Lincoln did not intend to abolish slavery. He tries to reassure the South that he does not in any way intend to interfere with slavery. But he does warn that no state has the right to leave the Union. So basically it's a threat there that if states don't return or don't stay within the Union, they're going to face the consequence. But he has no ambition to try to attack slavery, which of course the South still sees as a threat and so forth. And there's a very famous quote about Lincoln who said, if I could free all the slaves and save the Union, I would. If I could, keep all the slaves and save the Union, I would. So his ultimate goal is not to free slavery. His goal from the beginning of the war to the end of the war is to keep the country united. That's his ultimate goal, is to keep the country united as a result. All right, so the first shots that are going to be fired in the Civil War are going to be at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter, that's going to be in South Carolina and Charleston over here. Okay, so this the most critical issue that comes up when Lincoln first takes office is in late March, early April, when 2 federal forts were not surrendered to the South. So most of the federal territory was given up to the South as each state secedes. But there's a fort in Florida and there's a fort in South Carolina that refuses to give up. We're concerned with the one in Fort Sumter, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. Basically, the federal officers there for the Union, or for the North, did not want to leave because it was federal property. So they basically walled themselves up in the fort because the Fort Sumter was an island fort in Charleston Harbor, and so all these guys go into the island and basically just wait there until they get further instructions. They're not going to willingly give it over to the Southerners, basically. And at this point, I should point out, I'm going to refer to these different areas as by different names. The North is called Yankees or Union or Federals. The South are called Confederates or Rebels. Typically, those are the different areas we're talking about here. So Fort Sumter was cut off from supplies because when the South realizes that they're not leaving, the South doesn't allow any ship to go in or out. So the soldiers that are in Fort Sumter refuse to leave, and no ship can come resupply them, so eventually they're going to need food, and that's going to be the major concern here. Rather than give up the fort, Lincoln wants to hold it because it's federal property. So Lincoln announces in early April that he's going to resupply the fort, which the South has already said they're not going to allow any ship to do so. So basically, Lincoln's putting it on the South to fire the first shot because Lincoln says, I'm just going to send a ship to resupply these people with food, and that's it. So it's in South Carolina's hands now, essentially. So under Jefferson Davis, he's going to send over an army, actually under the command of P.G.T. Beauregard, who's a guy from Louisiana. You don't need to know that, but Beauregard goes out and takes his forces to Charleston. When the ship tries to dock with Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, he's going to command his cannons to open fire. And so on April 12th, 1861, the Civil War begins with the South firing the first shots on Fort Sumter. The shelling goes on for 2 days. Constant shelling back and forth, so the Yankees in the island will fire back on the South will fire into the island. No one dies. So for 2 days the shelling goes on, no one dies. After 2 days of fighting, the Northerners eventually agree to give it up. So the Northerners eventually do agree to leave the island. However, the only casualty of Fort Sumter was whenever the North was doing like their closing ceremony to leave the fort, and they were firing a cannon to like signal their departure. The cannon exploded and killed one of the guys on the cannon crew. So it was a friendly fire casualty that you had here, but that was the only casualty from Fort Sumter, was the guy who got killed by the cannon at the very end. But this now sparks a war or conflict between the two sides, both thinking they can win and win very quickly. So now we're going to look at Lincoln's use of executive power. More than any of his predecessors, Lincoln is going to act in unprecedented ways as president. You know, nowadays the president has a whole lot of power, can get a whole lot of things accomplished. They can make policies, they can make change. But back in those days, the president traditionally, you know, the president did very little. Congress was the movers and shakers of the federal government. So Lincoln's going to use these wartime powers to act in unprecedented ways that no one's really ever seen before. So after the Fort Sumter attack, Lincoln's going to call up 75,000 troops to go put down the South insurrection. So he's going to call up 75,000 volunteers to go put down the South's insurrection. Now, this only lasts, the enlistments that he calls for are only for like a few months. So they think that the war is going to be over really quickly. So the guys who volunteer and are supposed to only fight for about 6 to 9 months, I believe. So that was one thing that he does. So he's the only president to ever call up troops to go like fight, you know, American people. Number two, he authorizes spending for the war. So he also gets Congress to allow lots of spending to help support the war and finance the war's needs, like weapons and uniforms and supplies. Also, one of the most controversial things that he does while the war goes on is that he suspends the writ of habeas corpus. And you might remember this from last year. Writ, W-R-I-T, of habeas corpus. H-A-B-E-A-S, and then corpus, C-O-R-P-U-S. Habeas corpus was the right to basically have a warrant or some reasoning for your arrest. So what Lincoln does is he suspends habeas corpus, which means that any federal authority can go out and arrest people on any suspicion they may have. So in these border states, especially like Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and so forth, there's going to be lots of arrests of people who are suspected of rebellion, even if they weren't actually going to try to, or even if there wasn't really proof that they were going to do this either. But it was an effort to try to keep as many states as possible. So he suspends habeas corpus, which was a big deal. Only president to ever do so. And he does all this while Congress is not in session. So this is also unprecedented because he takes all these actions while Congress is not there to okay them. And no president has ever done something to this degree before. He says he does all this to protect public safety. So he takes his powers as commander-in-chief and extrapolates them and says, as commander-in-chief in a time of war, these are things I should be able to do. And so whether you think it's good or not, whether or not it's controversial, these are things that Lincoln did to help win the war. So after Fort Sumter, you do see the secession of the Upper South. These 4 states will leave now after Fort Sumter. Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia all will take off now and become part of the Confederacy in in about May of June 1861. Also, too, the capital will be moved from Montgomery to Richmond, Virginia, which is only about today like a 2-hour drive from Washington, D.C. So you have the Richmond capital here and D.C. right here, so they're right there next to each other in terms of location. West Virginia remained loyal. West Virginians refused to go with Virginia, so they break off, and then a couple years later, West Virginia becomes an official state. So West Virginians decide not to go with the rest of the state. They stay behind, and they'll become part of the new, they'll make themselves a new state into West Virginia in 1863. Then you're going to have the border states, the other border states that have slavery. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware all had slavery. And there was some efforts in these places for them to leave. Like Missouri, there's efforts for these people to leave, so was Kentucky and so forth. But because of the location, there's also a lot of people in these states who don't want to go either. And Lincoln's going to make very sure that Maryland doesn't go, because that's going to trap Washington, D.C. So he's going to use military force to keep Maryland in place. So Lincoln will declare martial law to make sure Maryland, even though it has slavery and wanted to leave, does not leave, because that would make the North lose their capital before the war even gets going. So Delaware, Maryland, and Missouri and Kentucky stayed because a lot of people in those states had sentiment to stay with the North. Like I said, martial law was put into place in Maryland by Lincoln. It was also used to suppress any secessionists and to try to keep D.C. intact. In Missouri, the presence of U.S. troops prevented that pro-Southern forces from gaining control. So Missouri was another state that Lincoln had to use military force to keep. Kentucky remained loyal, so Kentucky wasn't ever really a problem, neither was Delaware. But keeping these border states was a political and military goal of Lincoln, because it would increase the population. It would, if they went, it would increase the population of the South 50%. So if those 4 states went down with the rest of the Confederacy, that would double the population of the South, which is what Lincoln does not want. Plus, also too, he can kind of use them against the South later on, because they're also Southern slave states too. So he's also reluctant to do emancipation yet. That's the big thing why he doesn't do emancipation or talk about freeing slaves at this point when the war first breaks out. Because if you bring out emancipation or freeing slavery at this point, these 4 states are going to try tooth and nail to leave. So he has to keep the border states. So when the war first breaks out, this war is about bringing the Union back together, not about destroying slavery. That will come later on with the war. But right now, he cannot talk about emancipating slaves, or else he runs the risk of losing those border states whenever the war breaks out. Okay, and that'll be the end of our first video.